Welcome, everyone, to Indications and Warnings with Chuck Pfarrer, co-produced by Alan Brewer. Chuck and I are recording this show, the very first of 2025, on January 2nd. It is day 1044 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. Chuck, we're going to go right to the good news today because it's coming from the most surprising place of all. It's coming from Kursk.
Yes, pretty amazing. As we know, the Ukrainian Expeditionary Force is still dug in Kursk. They enjoy secure ground lines of communication and supply. The highway system that they are coalesced around allows them to resupply and reinforce and travel within the salient that they have captured. They have a city upon which they can rely, Sudza. They are there, dug in, and although they have lost their original high water mark was approximately 1,000 square kilometers, they are down to somewhere around 500 square kilometers. But what we've had happen in the last 24 to 36 hours, North Korean and Russian forces had been attacking from the west. Those attacks, not surprisingly to you and I, all came not only to naught, but completely eviscerated the attacking force. So the 810th Brigade of Russian Naval Infantry is no more. Anyone who's still alive from that outfit and are listening to us, good job. With them, a cohort of North Korean soldiers at this point numbering possibly 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing, with the total casualties, as you just informed me before we came up here, approximately 38,000 Russian casualties trying to take back Kursk Oblast. And I will also point out that the initial force posture, about a division and a half, 50,000 Russian and North Korean soldiers, of which 38,000 are now pushing up sunflowers. We told you that this was going to be a hard fight for the Russians to take it back, and it really has been, Alan.
Well, General Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army, was in Kursk Oblast on December 30th, meeting with troops, also handing out commendations to the Ukrainian soldiers who are there. And it's Syrskyi who has reported this 38,000 casualty figure of the combined forces of Russia and North Korea fighting in Kursk. But and today, Ukraine aimed a HIMARS strike at Russian forces coming to reinforce those troops in Kursk. And just yesterday, Ukraine targeted a Russian command post in Kursk, absolutely leveled it. So I'm not really surprised by the 38,000 casualty number that General Syrskyi announced to the press. It seems verifiable and quite believable to me.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And there is a perfect confluence of corruption, ineptitude, bad training, poor equipment, bad morale. All of these things on the Russian side accrete to make their military activities extremely costly, amateurishly put together, resorting to frontal attacks and brute force maneuvers that, frankly, no one seemed to tell them that this is the 21st century. This is a completely new kind of war, and they're losing badly. And I'm not afraid to say that. If you started with 50,000 people, and since August, you've lost 38,000 just in this one area, that's not what winning looks like.
It sure isn't, and it's not what reclaiming Kursk Oblast looks like for Vladimir Putin either. I think at this point, Chuck, we can be more confident than ever that the Ukrainians will hold on to Kursk throughout the winter. And that continues to embarrass Putin. But do you think the Kursk incursion, can we say now it has accomplished everything that the Ukrainians hoped it would accomplish?
Well, I don't think its utility has ended. It is a vital bargaining chip should bargaining ever come to fruition. In terms of, risk to reward, it was a very well planned operation. Holding on to a big chunk of Mother Russia is important. Although it didn't have the immediate effect of diverting large amounts of Russian resources out of the war in Ukraine, it has diverted something that might even be more important. And you and I have talked about this a lot, that the bandwidth of Russian high command, it isn't very big. They can't take on a lot of far-flung enterprises. And, frankly, I mean, in this, we joke about this. Look, it takes 30 years to make a general, right? It takes 30 years to make a good general. And Putin has no good generals, none of them. And it's showing on the battlefield every day.
It's possible that maybe the best general Putin had, Surovikin, who devised the Surovikin defense line a couple of years ago and was relieved. No one actually knows where he is. Could be in prison. No one knows. He might well have been Putin's best general, but he unfortunately had close ties to Prigozhin.
Well, and there is the other thing that you can say what we want about Prigozhin. We called it like it was. This is a guy with an eighth grade education. He was a thug, a hoodlum, certainly a cunning man. He had never been to war in his life. And like everyone who's ever thrown into a war, it takes you about 30 days to realize this is a colossal waste. It's a waste. He was responsible for taking back Bakhmut, where he was responsible for killing maybe 80,000 of his own troops. And he snapped.
Yeah.
Right? Because he could not speak truth to power. Through the lens of the Russian high command, he couldn't get to who he thought was a rational friend of his. He couldn't speak to Putin. And we know what happened to him. No one can speak power to Putin. Speak truth to power is what I should have said. I'm sorry.
This is true. No one can deliver the facts to Putin. You can't deliver facts to dictators who are bent on destruction and listen only to themselves. Interestingly enough, Surovikin, as I recall, actually was in Syria directing Russian troops. I then was deployed to Ukraine as one of the top commanders, but now long gone. And just one other thing about Kursk, of course, I also saw today a Russian claim that they have about 440,000 new recruits and contract signers ready to go into the military. What struck me about the number, Chuck, is it is just about equal to the Russian casualties killed, wounded, missing in action for 2024. So they're just barely able to do a one-for-one replacement. And the guys coming from Russia, they have none of the experience that the soldiers who have suffered in Ukraine, they have none of that experience. So it's not really a one-to-one replacement, is it?
No, it isn't. They have 400,000 people that they are going to give green pants and a green jacket to, and they're going to send them into what is, for the Russians, a meat grinder. These people have no training. They're not going to get any. They're not going to be diverted. They won't even receive the most rudimentary portion of military training. They won't go to boot camp for 3 months. They're not even going to go there. And boot camp is where you learn high pressure janitorial skills, right? You don't learn a military occupational specialty, which generally in the United States Army, that takes another year. And in some cases, in some military occupational specialties, it takes you 2 years. For example, to become a SEAL takes, I don't know, 2.5 years, 3 years. It depends on the training cycle. So these people, these citizens are being thrown into this war. Again, another reason why good news or bad news from the Ukrainian battlefield, losses or gains, Russia is never going to win this war. They are not going to win it.
Some of those new Russian soldiers have signed contracts. Others are part of the twice annual draft that Russia runs, one in the spring, one in the fall. Generally, these recruits in the semi-annual draft aren't supposed to be sent to the front lines. They're sent to guard duty in Vladivostok, but it so happens that some of them were sent to guard duty in Kursk. They were among the first to surrender. So one would expect, a chunk of them are going to be deployed to Kursk and to Ukraine. In other words, that's Putin going back on his promise, as he goes back on every promise to anyone, whether it's the Russian people or anyone he's negotiating with in international politics.
Well, and he is really riding the tiger on that one. We have heard from Russian prisoners themselves saying they had no idea where they were. They found themselves in a shooting war in Ukraine. They weren't supposed to be there. It is simply a matter of time. And as we know, if you are drafted, it's not considered sending you to the Ukrainian war to send you to fight in Kursk, where, fight's on, right? 38,000 casualties, which I think is low. I think that's a low number. But you can die there as well. And again, even the draft, the people who are inducted, they are not being given a foundation in military training. There isn't time. They're going right from getting rounded up at a construction site to, a fight with pointy bullets, and it's showing.
It sure is. And we're going to go to the opposite end of the zero line to Kherson, and the tatters of the Russian army are showing there as well. But on our way to Kherson, it's really necessary to stop in Pokrovsk and in Velika Novosilka. Just make a mention of Kurakova. This is, of course, the hottest spot on the zero line in the course of any day. Maybe 150 combat engagements reported, but at least half are coming from Pokrovsk, Velika Novosilka, and Kurakova. When you put those three battle areas together, more than half, really. But we talked just a couple of days ago, Chuck, about Pokrovsk and the Russian maneuver to possibly encircle it. I think we said it won't be days, but it will be weeks.
Yeah, there is a long way for Russia to go before it ever is going to get to Pokrovsk, which, the baseline version of this, and you've heard Ukrainian soldiers say it, we are lucky that they are so effing stupid. Just to get slightly more articulate that position, the Russians tend to get fixated on points of geography.
Yeah.
Bakhmut, for example, in this case, Pokrovsk, they are locked into getting there by the direct route, and they don't do anything else. They're still not there, right? I don't know that they're going to get there this winter. It just, and again, there's no military leadership. There is no generalship. And below generals are field grade officers, colonels, majors, lieutenant colonels. There's no leadership there either. There's no tactical innovation. There's no dialogue between commanders and commanded, where in most places in the military, there's no place that's more collegial than the SEAL teams. We get an assignment, we all sit down, everyone's talking on their first name. We put the plan together, and that isn't really the way things go, but that's the way it goes in that very tiny corner of the military. Generally, say in the Marine Corps, if the general comes down, he's got, I need this done, bing, bang, boom, and you come back with a plan and do it. But none of that happens in the Russian army. It is, you get a platoon-sized attack, hit here, aye, aye, sir. You mean the place we hit yesterday and the day before and the day before? Yes, that's the place I mean. And it's not working. Just isn't working.
Well, they are on the doorstep of Pokrovsk. And can the Ukrainians hold out for the entire winter? I don't know. I mean, I would assume that Ukraine is reinforcing Pokrovsk and also improving the defensive network they've created in Pokrovsk. But the Russians are on the doorstep, Chuck.
They definitely are. There is a flat, the southernmost limit of Pokrovsk is an east-west facing. There are apartment buildings. There is built-up terrain and military operations in urban terrain. So these are blasted out buildings, but there are still multi-stories, and it is looking down at the direct approaches. And the Russians keep pushing that way. I don't need to remind the Ukrainians that one of the means by which the Russians gained access to Avdiivka was pushing themselves through sewers and underground utility conduits, etc. I am certain that the Russians are doing that here. They are trying to get to Pokrovsk. And we say this a lot too. If you know what your enemy's going to do, if you know that's more than half the battle, right? Because the first thing that happens when you actually get shot at is you go, where are the enemy? Where are they? They're not often in front of you. That's only in the movies, So will they get to Pokrovsk? I don't know, but we'll see. Again, 435,000 casualties this year, and the Russians have only taken a piece of ground not quite as big as Los Angeles County. And as Charlie Sheen says, that's not what winning looks like, is it?
That's right. And he would know.
And he would know.
He lives in Los Angeles County.
He would know. I've actually partied with Charlie Sheen, and let me tell you, it's not for everybody. Actually, he's a friend from a long time.
And the Russians sacrificed 100 soldiers per square kilometer in the course of 2024. It's interesting. Over the last 2 or 3 months, a lot of press reports have suggested that Russians are occupying more land at an increased rate of speed. It's actually not true. The Russian advance has slowed, certainly in December. And what Russia has needed to sacrifice to take that 1 square kilometer has doubled. No longer 100 soldiers, but in the last 90 days, 200 soldiers to take 1 square kilometer of fields, basically, right, Chuck?
Absolutely. And, there are places where that number is quintupled. I would say in the couple of grid squares to the east of Chasiv Yar, I would say the number per square kilometer might be 10 or 15,000 instead of 100 or 200. And I think that might even be low, because we are looking at the distance between Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar. And I'm afraid we called this 2.5 years ago. It's still in Ukrainian hands.
Yeah. Of course, there's a Chasiv Yar sits atop an escarpment, Pokrovsk, surrounded by open fields. And when I look at this Pokrovsk map, it strikes me especially in winter. All that open terrain offers the Ukrainian defenders in Pokrovsk almost as much defensive advantage as the heights of Chasiv Yar give to the Ukrainian defenders in Chasiv Yar.
It really does. And, in these days, we're looking at every valuable weapon system has got a thermal sight on it, including rifles. And nothing works better than a thermal sight in the winter. Your concealment in almost every case doesn't afford you any concealment at all. It's very hard to camouflage yourself. There are means by which you can limit your thermal signature. I'm not going to tell the Russians what they are. We've seen their comical attempts to even try, but these, these are the other things that, again, making the Russians so completely predictable. They are not allowed to have a quiet sector anywhere. They are required to keep throwing people forward. And we just have to really say this. You're putting forward almost 2,000 people a day, certainly 1,000 people a day, rarely less than that. And what are you gaining? Almost nothing. And when you talk about 400,000 people dead to take an area smaller than Rhode Island, which as New Englanders, you and I know, Rhode Island is mostly water, right? Yeah. It's Narragansett Bay is what. Right. So it just absolutely isn't working. And what so convinces me that Ukraine is going to win this war is that the training system is gone. The chain of command is utterly corrupt. The generalship is utterly inept. These operations are too wasteful to be sustained. They've lost 700,000 people. Went through that the other day. That's more than the army of the UK, France, Germany, and almost half of the Polish army thrown in 1,000 days.
Yeah.
Okay. I know I'm a naval officer. Don't trust me on land warfare, but I know what I'm talking about here.
And yet Putin believes he can win, and therefore he's not giving up. I think in a way that is to Ukraine's advantage. The longer Putin attempts to win this unwinnable war brings Putin a day closer, probably to the end of his regime, but certainly it brings Russia a day closer to having to give up the fight in Ukraine because they won't be able to carry it out.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this a lot. The strategic goal, the overarching goal of the Ukrainian war must be the diminishment of the Russian armed forces. You have got to take the cudgel out of Putin's hand. His army, every day you fight and you hollow out his army, regardless of where the needle is in terms of terrain, you're getting closer to what you want. And what we are going to see one glorious day is we are going to see the Russian army collapse. They're not there yet because the external circumstances are not there yet. You've got an army and they're pointed towards the enemy and they're conducting little attacks every day, but the morale is diminishing. Their circumstances are diminishing. The conception of this war in the heads of the average grunt, they're getting more and more dissatisfied. They are ripe for collapse, but what they're going to need to do is be hit, right? They're not going to collapse on a Tuesday carrying out their routine patrols. That doesn't happen in history, but it happens with the Russian military as it happened on their Western Front where their entire army collapsed, and so did the government, as we know.
Yeah, 1917, 1918, the events were quite remarkable. And it was a complete collapse of the Russian army. And they weren't even actually losing.
No, they weren't losing. But the average soldier realized that, in every attack, half of us are getting sent up there without a rifle. Yeah. We don't have ammunition. There are no doctors. We're not getting fed. And if you're keeping score on the Ukraine war, check, 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 check.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly waiting for that day, as you point out, Chuck. It does take that Ukrainian counter-offensive punch in the nose for it to happen. But turn the tables. We've seen Ukraine on defense an entire year now, not adequately armed at the beginning of the year, really suffering a shortage of shells, approached a shell starvation on many parts of the zero line. And yet we have Ukraine holding on, taking tremendous Russian casualties, destroying a tremendous number of Russian tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, radar installations, vehicles of all kinds, very sensibly finding those fuel depots and logistical hubs in the rear and targeting those as well. And again, to contrast it with the Russian way of war, wouldn't you think there would be a Russian general at this point who would say, there is a more vital military target for my missiles and glide bombs than an apartment building in Zaporizhia or Kyiv? Wouldn't there be a general who says, I can use that bomb better on a military target?
You know, I think they are to the point. Well, interestingly, as the war progressed and Hitler's war aims became less and less focused. The beginning of World War II, he thought he was a genius, and it was hard to argue because he'd gotten the Sudetenland and he invaded France and he got Czechoslovakia and he got away with invading Poland. But later in the war, Hitler paid hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks to the upper generals in his cadre. He was bribing them. Okay. So I would say the average Russian general right now is certainly getting a backhander from Putin. And the roundabout way of asking your question is, he wouldn't even stick his neck out to do that. But there's more than one reason. First of all, the criminal orders from the top say target civilian areas. So that's what the boss wants. But there's another factor in there, and that is that the Ukrainians are masterful at dispersing their logistics. And where the Russians get wiped out, as they did in Kursk this week, with a 80 vehicle convoy coming down a single road into the battle space, and they get HIMARSed into the next dimension. The Ukrainians, that almost never happens to them, because they have sort of just-in-time delivery, right? They are like Federal Express. They can get it where it needs to be right away. But that, again, is emblematic of good generalship, right? And there is a logistical military occupational specialty in Ukraine, and that disappeared 2 years ago in the Russian army, where somebody said, there's too many effing truck drivers. I want you guys all to the front, where they got killed. And so now you've got what? Nothing. You got monkeys driving the truck. They don't know anything about depots, distribution, and it shows.
Yeah.
And those are the quagmires into which every Russian, they're sinking into that.
And this is the mistake I always make, Chuck, when I try to understand what the Russians are doing. I take a rational approach. There's no point to it. There's no way to understanding Russians, even Russian culture, if you take a rational approach. It doesn't work. I'm proof of it.
Yeah, well, I didn't think he'd do it. I just didn't think he'd do it, because I also looked at this. It would be worth your while if you could pull this off in 72 hours. You could get away with it, subdue Ukraine, and the world would shrug it off because it took 72 hours. I never thought it would take 72 hours. And I was looking at the myriad negative consequences that would directly evolve, right? Sweden losing its neutrality, Finland regalvanizing NATO, which had turned into the Kiwanis Club, right? Focusing the world's attention on this. He doesn't look ahead. He does not look ahead. And why should he? He lived in a world where if you didn't like something or somebody, you killed them.
Yeah.
And you just moved on. So
the remarkable thing is Putin has now been president of Russia for 25 years. I think ascended to the presidency on New Year's Eve, 1999. There's a whole generation of young Russians. They've known one president for life. It's Vladimir Putin, even though Dmitry Medvedev was a puppet president for a few years. And this has been their leader. It's no different, really, than having grown up in the regime of Stalin. And every single day, Putin is doing more to re-Stalinize Russia.
And this is a bit aspirational, but I'll point this out to everybody and remember it. These regimes seem absolutely monolithic, and they seem permanent until they're not. Insurgencies smolder, governments collapse, right? They collapse. And we've just had the recent example with Assad, right? 12 days. It took him 12 days to circle the drain.
Yeah.
And it's a lesson to Putin. It's a lesson to North Korea. Look, it could happen. Things are not wonderful in Putin world. He sustained this mutiny from Prigozhin. Remember, he disappeared for 10 days. No one knew where he was. It's never lost on Putin. He brushes his teeth in the morning and he remembers. Prigozhin's convoy, nobody stopped him. Nobody said halt. Nobody asked to see his pass. He just drove up Route 95 and was going to Moscow.
My guess is Putin uses a new toothbrush every morning just to be sure it hasn't been poisoned.
Yes, and anyone who can get him a new toothbrush, just give me a call. We'll give you something to put on it.
Pokrovsk, Kurakova, Velika Novosilka, all tied together in a way at this part of the zero line. But we're going to move from Pokrovsk to Velika Novosilka, where the Russians are attempting to surround this relatively small village. I think maybe 20,000 people might have lived there before the war. They are putting a lot of pressure on Ukrainian defenders in Velika Novosilka.
Yep, they are. I will admit this. When you see a map that Alan and I put out and it goes to a 2-kilometer scale or a 1-kilometer scale, we're zeroing in on an area we think will likely be troublesome. So, looking at Velika Novosilka, again, going north and south is the Mokry Yali River. It is in a valley, and there are, of course, the TO518 highway goes down. These towns, Makrovinka, Blahodante, Storazove, Mariinka, these towns, one by one, have come into the possession of the Russians as they push north. It is worrisome that they have, they are closing their jaws in on Velika Novosilka. However, you can look at that town and you can see if you possessed it, as the Russians want to do, what are you going to gain? There's one highway out. You already possess that. This is kind of a risk to reward. I don't know. This is another one of the good things about the Russians. They are putting a lot of effort into Velika Novosilka, which isn't going to get them much if they get it, right? And we talked about this year, they've gained less than 1% of the total landmass of Ukraine, less than Los Angeles County or Rhode Island, and much smaller than the state of Delaware. And if they take Velika Novosilka, it just isn't that big a deal. Look, there is no super highway coming out of here. It just isn't that important.
I suppose, in a way, the Russian motivation is to take back something they had before and lost to the Ukrainians. It was the summer of 2023, the fall of 2023, the Ukrainians fought through Velika Novosilka and right down along the Mokry Yali river valley there. So, I mean, Russia is taking back something it had previously occupied.
Yeah. Well, that is their goal. I mean, you are a Russian commander, you have a sector, you've got to report that you've captured something. But this isn't like General Sherman calling Washington or telegraphing Washington on Christmas to say he's captured Savannah. This is not a relevant place. It's it's a little town of 20,000 people. And again, this is, Ukraine defends these places perhaps in some cases longer than they should, because if you are fighting an attritional battle, right, and that strategic aim that I think is still relevant, hollow out the Russian army. And I think anyone can say right now that over the past, how many days is it? 1,300 days, the Russian army has lost 40, 50, 60% of its equipment.
Yeah.
They've lost 700,000 people, right? They've lost that would be like Germany, France, the UK, and Hungary totally wiping out their entire militaries, everybody, sailors, airmen, so everybody, and all of their equipment.
Yeah. I mean, 10,000, nearly 10,000 tanks at this point in the course of the war.
No other army on earth has 10,000 tanks to lose. And again, one of those reasons why he can't be this stupid. Don't do it. And, bold prediction now. This is going to be the reason there is a regime change in Russia. It can never be disconnected. What he's done to his country and his military can never be disconnected from the manner in which he leaves power.
This is exactly right. It will be the combination of this war and the casualties, an entire generation of Russian men wounded, injured, not receiving the care that they deserve as a veteran. So the result of this war and the weakness of the ruble, I mean, the ruble is weaker, I think, at its very weakest point right now, about I don't know, I think a 120, I think it reached 119 rubles to the dollar, so worth less than a penny. And then you have the Putin war machine budget. He's put the entire country on a war footing. He has moved any expenditure on civilian needs over to the military. And if you think the United States has an infrastructure problem, that we need to rebuild bridges and fix the potholes on the turnpikes and that kind of thing, Russia has a monumental infrastructure problem, and Putin is spending no money on it whatsoever. He's putting it all into his war against Ukraine.
Yep, and there are some very vital pieces of infrastructure that are like one-offs. For example, the principal means by which logistics can traverse the 12 time zones that are Russia is the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which is single track. And as we've had other guests on tell us, they're running their railroad into the ground, right? Just ball bearings for their rolling stock they can't get. And these rail cars and locomotives and even track and switching points, which also are under, there seems to be this new fun vandalism trend in Russia, and that is a low-level series of vandalistic attacks against rail points and signaling devices, which is not insignificant. Just a Molotov cocktail and a crowbar, or just the Molotov cocktail thrown into a signal box, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, especially on one-track railway.
Exactly, where the signals get wrong and you go from full speed ahead to head-on collision.
Yeah. I would encourage viewers to, in addition to looking at the 1 January map around Velika Novosilka, to look back in Chuck's timeline on Twitter and take a look at the 31 December map as well, which gives you a much wider scale, and you can see how Velika Novosilka and Kurakova really are tied together. But I think we should move on to Kherson. We briefly touched on Kherson the other day, Chuck, because of these reports that Russia was gathering forces and the equipment needed for a cross-river assault on Kherson. And we know that Putin has asked his military once again to occupy all of Kherson Oblast. That would require some kind of cross-river assault. But what are we hearing about Russian preparations now?
Well, we've heard that somewhere between 10 and 20,000 troops have been allotted to a project, let's call it, large-scale crossing of the Dnipro, certainly with the goal of retaking Kherson. It simply is not going to happen. We hear that somewhere around 300 boats have been assembled. But look, these are speedboats and pleasure craft that people had hanging in boat trailers in front of their riverside houses. That, they aren't high-speed riverine patrol craft. They are not, these aren't landing craft. These aren't Mike boats. So it's nothing. Let's say you've got 10,000 troops, which I believe the number is a little higher, and you got 300 boats. I think everyone can do the math. The likelihood that one speedboat is going to make it across the river is less than 50%, and the chance that that boat will make it back across the river and reload, that's 0%. The fact, let's say they had 10,000 people ready to go on a Sunday morning, and they tried to cross all of them, and let's say they got 5,000 people across. With what? A canteen of water, 300 rounds, and a Snickers bar. You're not going to make it. It isn't going to work.
How many speedboats do you need to move heavy equipment again, Chuck?
Yeah, the heavy, I forgot the artillery, the armor, the vehicles, but what's fascinating to me and encouraging is that this plan still seems to be okayed from the top.
Yeah.
It's idiotic. It's wasteless. Wasteful. It's impossible. And the Ukrainian military, who has itemized these and have the video receipts, suicide is endemic among Russian occupiers on the south bank of the Dnipro. They are killing themselves. 5 or 6 or many as 10 a day are committing suicide because their conditions are abysmal, right? They're in a marsh. It's wintertime. They're not getting fed. They're not being clothed. They're not even being rotated off the zero line. Okay, so I will just say this. If you've got an army that suicide is one of the leading causes of death, don't think that outfit could conduct complex military evolutions. It can't do it. It cannot do it. In fact, those guys are waiting for a big enough conflict, distraction, lights, noise to drop their weapons and run away. They pray for it.
The desertions from the south bank of the Dnipro among the Russian soldiers there have also been increasing. And as you always say, it's the Russian private who knows exactly what is happening and exactly what the remedy is that the entire Russian force in Ukraine needs, and that is to put on their boots, turn around, and go home.
Yeah, this war isn't winnable. The United States Army in Vietnam, after about 1968, everybody knew it. What, this isn't going to happen. It isn't going to win. We aren't going to win. There wasn't a plan. Was one of the reasons, right? The plan was never invade North Vietnam, take Hanoi, and that was never the plan. And the American military, the Pentagon at least, realized that years before the end of the war. We had Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. There was a top secret report that said, we can't win this, right? But the draft was still going on in the United States. And think of, with the United States, right, where there was democratic dialogue, where there are democratic, structures in place for the military, for the government, we still had a terrific amount of unrest. At least we could see it.
Yeah.
It wasn't in a closed pressure cooker. And that's the difference. And that's what's going on in Russia. People know.
I think increasingly people know, but it will take a very long time for them to escape the brainwashing that they suffer, and also to come together in some kind of protest. Well, the other thing that interests me about this preparation to cross the Dnipro, and this appears to be an order that's come from the very top, that Putin must have been dissatisfied with what the Russian forces have been doing to Kherson for all of 2024, just from their positions on the south bank of the Dnipro. They have launched what they call a drone safari against Kherson civilians. Just the other day, they struck a civilian bus, killing a civilian. They shell Kherson every day. This is a summary of all of 2024, 1,300 apartment buildings in Kherson, 150 schools, 111 kindergartens, 171 medical facilities, 114 administrative buildings, all targeted and destroyed. It's not only in Kherson on the north bank of the Dnipro River, because Kherson stretches across the river, but this is what the Russians have done all year against the civilian population of Kherson. Hasn't been enough for Putin. Putin now wants a cross-river assault in an attempt to occupy all of Kherson Oblast. And it is utter madness.
It's complete madness, and it would be wonderful, frankly, if the Russians attempted it. Were I a local commander, I would encourage them to do it, because they are going to lose every button they send across the Dnipro. Not one of those people are going to get away. They're not. They're all going to die on the North Bank. I mean, I would even, I'd let them cross. In some numbers, I wouldn't let it be unopposed, but I would certainly let them cross. It's that harebrained. It truly is. It's harebrained.
It really is harebrained. Yeah, I agree with you. Let them cross, and take out the speedboats on their next to last return, and you have a stranded force.
You absolutely do. And these guys are going to come across with 60 pounds is about your fighting gear. Less if you're a Russian soldier, because your helmet isn't real. Your body armor is quilted fabric. But, just your shooting kit, your rifle, 400 rounds, and I'm not kidding, a Snickers bar, your first aid kit, and some of these things. The more things I say that are Gucci gear, they don't have it, right? Night vision goggles, 5 sets of batteries, a streamlight, and a laser, all the good stuff that a 21st century soldier has. They don't have that. Here's the other thing. You come across that river, with a force that is a top-down micromanagerial force where initiative is never taught. You don't have initiative. You simply execute orders from the top. Those people get across. They have a fragmented command structure. They don't have any idea what to do. None. Zero. No idea. Nobody can read a map. Nobody can read a map. And so that's what I mean. He's got 440,000 new, I'm not going to say soldiers, he's got people. They're people. And I would say this to our listeners, and with all sympathy, try to imagine what your life would be tomorrow if I grabbed you and put you on the zero line in Ukraine. You would be weeping. And that's what these Russian boys, that's what's happening to them. They have no clue. Even the tough guy criminals. Welcome to the bigs, dude.
Yeah.
I'm glad you stabbed little old ladies for a living, man. This is it.
And it's not just the boys, it's their fathers who are signing contracts for the bonus pay because it's their only chance to balance their books in life in Russia. You know,
it's hard. That to me is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And in some of these Z-Force units, the average age of a private is 43 years old. Right. 43. Believe me, your door kicking days are getting pretty short when you're 43.
Yeah.
Take it from me, folks. I tell you, I got out, just before I ceased being a legend. Okay.
The other thing about what's happening down in Kherson on the south bank of the Dnipro, of course, the Ukrainians did cross the Dnipro, not obviously in a massive river crossing, but rather in river crossing raids, establish some force there. They've withdrawn those forces to the best of my knowledge. There's actually today people who look back at those Ukrainian Dnipro River crossings are quite upset about them and feel that they serve almost no purpose. There are families who don't actually know what happened to the soldiers in their family who are involved in those river crossings. So, in other words, the Ukrainians who attempted these maneuvers, trained for them, carried them off to the best of their ability. They've withdrawn pretty much to the other side of the Dnipro, to the north bank. The Russians would be well advised to learn from the Ukrainian experience, it seems to me.
Well, there's still several Ukrainian lodgements there around the rail crossing, which is to the east of the Anatovsky Bridge. There are some Ukrainian lodgements on the south bank. And again, raids are not the kind of military operations that really move the needle. A raid is just that. You get in, you kick some butt. A raid always has another component. Raid is the name for that kind of operation. You want to do that for another purpose, but whether it's reconnoitering the enemy, a lot of times we go on a raid to grab some prisoners. You go on a raid to sabotage something. You go on a raid to set up a, observation post, etc. The other thing that is telling is there aren't very many Russian raids across the river. And I would just suggest this: raiding forces have to be trained to a higher level, right? And tactical authority has to go down far enough so that your senior NCO or junior commissioned officer leading that raid, you've allowed him the tactical latitude to do what he needs to carry out that job. There is no tactical delegation in the Russian army. And you know what? There won't be for decades to come. They need a fundamental they don't need a reboot. They need a new freaking laptop with a new operating system, right? And that's the other thing. Look, Russia is being ground to pieces here, and they are in this death cycle of poor leadership, bad results, diminished resources. You know, a general officer has resources and objectives, and he has to balance the resources and to the objectives. And there's a secret sauce in the middle, and that is getting the absolute most out of the men and women who work for you, taking care of them, letting them know you'll go to the mat for them, letting them know you're the most important resource they have. None of that happens in the Russian army, and it goes back to before the Napoleonic Wars. That isn't the way Russian soldiers are treated, and it never will be.
And it certainly contrasts with how Ukrainian soldiers are treated. If a Ukrainian commander is seen as not valuing the lives of his soldiers, he's quickly relieved of duty.
Yeah, and it's it's simply the way it is. You'd get relieved from duty if you're in charge of a bunch of tanks and you never change the oil, right? You never clean the guns. You just, you don't sight in your artillery. You're gone. Leader of infantry, you've got to get those people. You've got to get the most out of them. And it's so easy. It's so easy. Just give a shit, right? Stand up for your people. That's all you've got to do. Every victorious army is the same. The men and women in that army will die for the commander who takes care of them, right? And every army that flies apart, they've got the same kind of leader. Santa Anna instead of Zachary Taylor, right?
Yep, right.
There you go. Perfect.
Yeah. And look at what the Roman soldiers did for Julius Caesar. They absolutely anything for him. And look at what he demanded of them. The impossible.
And they delivered.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the majesty. That's the magic. That's the secret sauce.
So many surprises and unpredictable events have happened in 1,041 days of war in Ukraine. And at this point, 1,041 days deep into the war, even more surprising, unpredictable things are happening, especially when you look at Ukrainian drones, the new capabilities that they have been given, and especially the Magura V5 naval drone shocked the hell out of a couple of pilots in Russian helicopters, Chuck.
Yeah, I think they definitely had a bad day. We put up a infographic on this. We first caught wind of this about a year ago, and did an infographic drawing, and it showed a similarly configured Magura that was packing sidewinders. And the weapon that actually came into fruition is a Vimpel R-73, Russian Soviet weapon analogous to a Sidewinder, not quite varying capabilities, but a capable heat-seeking missile. The R-73 is heat-seated, and it has a bore sight. So you're looking at an infrared camera, and that allows the flight surfaces to home in on a heat source. The infrared camera has about a capability to engage targets about 40 degrees off the bore sight. So basically 90 degrees, not 180, but 90 degrees. We can see from some early film of the engagement, Mi-8 helicopters, which is a utility helicopter used by the Russians. It's their Black Hawk, not nearly as capable, almost as versatile though. And some are configured for attack, some are for transport. One of the first responding Mi-8s that got there basically had machine guns. They had enough sensors, and I could tell by the altitude from which this helicopter was, they could look down on there and somebody said, oh, holy crap, this thing's packing. And I'm sure the pilot looked over and went, holy crap, he's packing because their altitude was too high, etc. There were other videos from the Russian helicopters where they showed they were coming in behind the Magura, which was the only safe access. But they were pretty surprised when these are air-to-air intercept missiles, right? This is what a fighter plane would shoot at another fighter plane. And we know that one Mi-8, those guys wound up swimming home, and another one likely crash landed on the way home. We've actually got the air intercept the radio traffic. This guy saying, "Holy, I've been hit." And so a great day for the Ukrainian military and another first in the history of warfare.
Yeah, I believe that Russian word is bliat, from
Yeah.
what I understand, Chuck.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm trying to remember that.
so the Ukrainians basically have swept the Russian Black Sea fleet from the Black Sea. Have the Ukrainians now made the airspace of the Black Sea unsafe for Russian helicopters, at least?
They have made it a non-permissive environment. So that means that every time you head out, if you head west from Crimea, you don't know when you're going to run into one of these things. So again, and this has never happened in the history of warfare before. Never has a remotely piloted surface combatant shot down an enemy aircraft. It has never happened before. Early in the engagement, there were fixed wing Russian aircraft trying to strafe the drone. I think at least one missile was fired at a Russian fixed wing. The other thing is we don't know how many Manguras were in this engagement. And I have a rule in the military, and that is one is none. So it was very likely two, maybe three, but very likely two. Because why would you send one out there? Like, think about it.
Yeah.
One could malfunction, whatever. You want to make a statement, and then one is none. That's what we always say. You always carry two of a critical mission item. So this changed a lot in the Western Black Sea. It has changed a lot.
And if two or three are out there, it means you have more of those Vimple missiles to fire. So, the naval drones that Ukraine has developed so quickly, and this is so much more advanced than the Sea Babies that they launched over a year and a half ago. And this also makes you think, what are the Ukrainians going to think of next, whether it's with unmanned vessels or unmanned land drones or FPV or super heavy cargo drones. There seems to be just an endless array of ideas that the Ukrainians have, and these ideas always surprise the Russians.
They always do. And to our Russian listening guests, and I'm glad to say we do have some, the word for today is torpedoes. That's the word for today. There are, in the world of torpedoes, torpedoes like a shirt, right? You could spend $2,000 on a shirt. You can get a Mark 48 ad cap torpedo. I mean, that'll do anything. In the submarine service, they call that little wish me dead, right? Because it just doesn't miss. However, there are a class of torpedoes called Black Scorpions, and they are everything that used to be big and take up a lot of space can now be put in a torpedo that maybe four guys could lift up, like instead of the crane. And anyway, these things are certainly deployable from drones, and very likely, maybe this winter we'll see a torpedo kill from a Ukrainian drone. The problem is for the Ukrainians is the Western Black Sea is no longer a target-rich environment. The Russians have withdrawn the great portion of their surface combatants into the extreme Eastern Black Sea.
Yeah.
And again, never happened before in warfare. that a nation without a navy has exerted surface warfare control over a considerable span of ocean. Again, no one thought of this 1,000 days ago. Nobody was writing papers about it. Nobody said anything about this.
Well, who knows what unpredictable events will occur in the next 1,000 days, and there may well be 1,000 more days of this war left to fight. As we approach the end of the very first indications and warnings of 2025, I want to remind folks of one thing that Ukrainian civilians endured in 2024, and a Ukrainian agency that collected and added up the number of air raid alerts that sounded throughout Ukraine in 2024. 21,600, Chuck. 21,600 air raid alerts. The 1,700 in January 2024, 1,300 just in the month of December just passed, and in the middle of the year, in May and June, more than 2,000 air raid alerts in each of those months. So in 21,000 instances, the Ukrainians all over Ukraine responding to the air raid alert, looking for shelter, so going to the subway in Kyiv, or sheltering in place and hoping for the best. Very few people know what an air raid siren sounds like. So I encourage people to tune into a video from Kharkiv or from Kyiv. Listen to the sound of that air raid siren, and then imagine having to wait for it every single day, every single night, because that is the reality in Kyiv and Kharkiv and Kherson and Zaporizhia and Kyiv, and even in Western Ukraine, in Lviv, for example, and on the front line again in Sumy.
And I would point out there was an apartment in a building on a beautiful square in a sort of Belle Epoque building, and a Shahed drone just happened to crash through the window of that balcony, and it killed a world-renowned neurobiologist and his professor wife in a calculated act of murder. And that is by no means the only calculated attack that we have had. Earlier, 18 months ago, a prominent Ukrainian journalist was hit with a Caliber cruise missile, her balcony, her window. So it isn't just that they're aiming at apartment buildings. It is that they are doing their best to take out prominent Ukrainian citizens. And what a neurobiologist could possibly be working on in a military capability. And of course he wasn't. He was a professor at a researcher at a medical school. That's Ruski Mir, right? That's the enemy. That's a legitimate target for Russians.
Yeah. Well, and then there are all the Ukrainian civilians who only become known to the world when they become a victim of Russian terror. So an ordinary Ukrainian walking down the street in Kherson, for example, to go to the market, instead becomes a target of a Russian drone. There's so much for us to keep watching here, Chuck, as 2025 begins. We will keep our eye, especially on Pokrovsk and Velika Novosilka, I thought it was interesting today that the general staff said the situation around Chasivyar was stable. Very few engagements now reported from Chasivyar. That the situation around Vovchansk, so northeast of Kharkiv, stable. There are some good things happening for the Ukrainians on the zero line, and some very hot spots that we'll keep our eye on as the first days of 2025 unfold and as we get into Ukrainian winter.
Yep. And again, we do this so you can dominate your own informational microcosm. 700,000 casualties later, Ukraine is nowhere near subdued. The Russians are never going to reach the Dnipro River. The way you win wars is major divisional level combined arms ground maneuver warfare that the Russian army is no longer capable of doing, right? This war is lost for the Russians. It's going to go on, and this Russian machine is going to just keep eating itself, right? But there's good news from the battlefield. Look, wars suck. You know, every SEAL I know, look, we are all peaceniks because we've seen it. It sucks, but you've got to do it. Ukraine did not start this war. They did not provoke it. They've done everything they could to avoid it, but now we're in it, and we know the way this has got to go.
We do. We know that someday when we say Slava Ukraini, it will be the day of victory.
Absolutely, and that'll be the day that Indication in Mornings goes to its reconstruction phase. But until then, Heroim Slava.
Thank you, Chuck. See you soon.